Listen, friend, and I call you friend because anyone willing to settle in for a long story about coins and small-town banking drama clearly has the kind of patience and curiosity I admire. Tonight's tale is about the time America nearly ran out of pocket change, all because one woman refused to let her customers be cheated by even a single penny. I wonder where you're listening from right now. Maybe you're in your car, watching gas prices that would have seemed like pure fantasy in 1964, fishing through your cup holder for exact change, and finding nothing but lint and old gum wrappers. Or perhaps you're at home, sorting through that jar of loose change everyone keeps meaning to cash in, wondering why we even bother with pennies anymore. Hold onto that thought. By the end of tonight's story, you'll understand exactly why every single copper coin can matter more than you ever imagined. Before we dive into the chaos, madness, and accidental revolution that was the great coin shortage of 1964, let me set the scene for you. Picture America at its most optimistic. The Beatles had just arrived, the economy was booming, and President Johnson was promising a great society where everyone would have enough of everything. It was the kind of time when people genuinely believed that technology and good intentions could solve any problem. When the future seemed as bright and shiny as a freshly minted quarter, but prosperity, as our ancestors knew, and we keep forgetting, brings its own complications. More money meant more transactions. More transactions meant more need for coins, and more coins meant, well, that's where our story gets interesting. Our tale centers on Patricia, Patsy McKenzie, a 34-year-old bank teller at the First National Bank of Millerville, Kansas. Population 3,847, not counting the Hendersons' new baby, who'd arrived just that March. Patsy had been working at the bank for 11 years, ever since she'd graduated high school, and decided that counting other people's money was preferable to the alternatives available to young women in small Kansas towns circa 1953. Millerville was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody else's business, where the arrival of a new family was front-page news in the weekly Millerville Gazette, and where the biggest excitement most weeks was whether the high school football team might actually win a game. It sat at the intersection of two state highways that most people used to get somewhere else, surrounded by wheat fields that stretched to the horizon like a tan ocean, dotted with grain elevators that rose like lighthouses in the prairie wind. The First National Bank of Millerville occupied the corner of Main Street and 2nd Avenue in a building constructed in 1923 with all the solid, imposing architecture that small-town banks used to announce their permanence and trustworthiness. Red brick, white columns, marble steps worn smooth by decades of farmers' boots and ladies' heels, and a vault door so substantial that children dared each other to spin the massive handle. Patsy McKenzie stood 5 feet 2 inches in her sensible heels, had prematurely gray hair that she wore in a style that had been fashionable sometime around 1955 and possessed the kind of mathematical mind that could balance a ledger to the penny while carrying on a conversation about the weather, the Henderson babies' sleeping habits, and whether the Kowalski farm was going to survive another year of wheat rust. What made Patsy special, and what would soon make her famous in ways she never anticipated, was her absolute, unwavering commitment to accuracy. She had never, not once in 11 years of banking, ended a day with her cash drawer off by so much as a single cent. She checked every transaction twice, counted every roll of coins before she opened it, and treated customer deposits and withdrawals with the same meticulous care that a pharmacist might use measuring life-saving medicine. This obsession with precision might have been merely an admirable personal quirk, except for one crucial detail. Patsy McKenzie worked the busiest teller window at the only bank in a farming community that did most of its business in cash, during an era when exact change wasn't just expected. It was demanded by social convention and economic necessity. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning in March 1964, when Harold Zimmerman, who ran the grain elevator and considered himself something of a local economist, came into the bank to deposit the weekend's receipts from farmers selling their winter wheat. Harold was a large man who moved with the deliberate confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything important, and he had definite opinions about the efficiency of business operations. He slapped a canvas bag full of bills and coins onto Patsy's counter with the kind of authority that suggested he expected immediate service and perfect accuracy. "Morning, Patsy," Harold said, consulting his pocket watch as if her response time was being officially recorded. "I need this deposited to the elevator account, and I need it done quick. I've got 3 trucks waiting to unload, and time is money." Patsy smiled the professional smile she had perfected over 11 years of customer service and began counting Harold's deposit. Bills first. 1s, 5s, 10s, 20s, all sorted and organized with the practiced efficiency of someone who had handled thousands of such transactions. Then the coins, quarters, dimes, nickels, and pennies, each denomination counted twice and recorded on the deposit slip with careful precision. The total came to $347.63. Patsy counted it again, because Harold Zimmerman was not the sort of customer who would appreciate errors, and because her own reputation for accuracy was something she guarded more carefully than the bank's vault. $347.63. "I'm showing a deposit of $347.63, Patsy announced, sliding the deposit slip across the counter for Harold's approval. Harold glanced at the slip, then at his own handwritten record, and frowned. "That's not right," he said. "Should be $347.64. You're short a penny." Patsy counted the coins again, more slowly this time, aware that Harold's frown was deepening and that other customers were beginning to notice the delay. quarters, 42, totaling $10.50. Dimes, 17, totaling $1.70. Nickels, 8, totaling 40 cents. Pennies, she counted them twice, touching each one as she moved it from one pile to another. 3 cents. Mr. Zimmerman, I'm showing 63 cents in coins. 3 pennies, 8 nickels, 17 dimes, and 42 quarters. That's definitely 63 cents. Harold's face was beginning to show the red flush that the people of Millerville had learned to recognize as the warning sign of an impending Harold Zimmerman lecture on business efficiency and the decline of modern customer service standards. Patsy, I counted that money 3 times before I left the office. I've got it written down right here. He produced a small notebook and pointed to an entry made in the careful block letters he had learned in penmanship class 50 years earlier. $347.64. You people need to be more careful. Now, at this point in our story, you might wonder why a single penny should matter to either party. After all, we're talking about less than 1/300th of the total deposit, an amount so small that most people today wouldn't bother to pick it up off the sidewalk. But in 1964, in Millerville, Kansas, a penny mattered for reasons that went far beyond its monetary value. Harold Zimmerman had built his reputation on the precision of his business operations, and admitting to an error in basic arithmetic would damage his standing in a community where mathematical accuracy was considered a fundamental measure of a man's competence. For Patsy McKenzie, the penny mattered even more. Her entire professional identity was built on the foundation of absolute accuracy. If she couldn't count a simple deposit correctly, how could customers trust her with their life savings? How could the bank trust her with thousands of dollars in daily transactions? Mr. Zimmerman, Patsy said, with the patient firmness that had served her well in countless similar situations. I understand your concern, but I've counted this deposit 3 times now, and I'm confident in my total. If you'd like, I can count it again while you watch. Harold's flush deepened. I don't have time to watch you count pennies, Patsy. I've got business to run. Just credit my account for $347.64, and we'll call it even. This was the moment that changed everything. A lesser teller might have yielded to Harold's authority, added the penny to avoid conflict, and absorbed the small loss as the cost of maintaining customer relations. The bank's policies actually provided for such minor discrepancies. Variances of less than $5 could be written off as operational expenses. But Patsy McKenzie was not a lesser teller, and she was not willing to compromise her standards for the sake of expediency or to accommodate a customer's error, however small. I'm sorry, Mr. Zimmerman, but I can't credit your account for more money than you've actually deposited. If you believe there's been an error, I'd be happy to have Mr. Peterson take a look. James Peterson was the bank president, a dignified man in his 60s who had built the first national bank of Millerville into the solid, conservative institution it had become through careful attention to detail and unwavering adherence to proper procedures. Harold's face went from red to purple. "You're going to call the bank president over a penny. Don't you think that's a little ridiculous, Patsy?" "What's ridiculous?" Patsy replied with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from being absolutely certain of one's position, "is asking me to falsify a deposit record because you miscounted your change." The phrase "falsify a deposit record" hung in the air like smoke from a backfiring tractor. Other customers in the bank's lobby began to take notice of the conversation, and Harold became aware that his mathematical competence was being publicly questioned by a bank teller who stood barely higher than his chest. "Fine," Harold said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that suggested this conversation would be repeated and embellished in every coffee shop and grain elevator in 3 counties. "Get Peterson. Let's settle this right now." James Peterson emerged from his office with the measured pace of a man who had learned that most banking disputes could be resolved through patience, diplomacy, and careful attention to the facts. He listened to Harold's complaint, examined Patsy's count, and verified the deposit total with his own careful calculation. "Mr. Zimmerman," Peterson said in the tone he reserved for delivering unwelcome but indisputable news, "I'm showing $347.63. Miss Mackenzie's count appears to be correct." Harold stared at the coins spread across the counter, as if they might somehow rearrange themselves into the total he expected. "That's impossible. I counted this money myself, and I wrote down 347.64. Peterson picked up Harold's notebook and examined the entry. "I can see that you wrote down 64 cents, but perhaps you miscounted when you prepared the deposit. It happens to all of us." The suggestion that Harold Zimmerman, who had been managing money and grain transactions for 23 years, might have made a simple arithmetic error, was apparently too much to bear. "Are you people calling me a liar?" Harold demanded, his voice loud enough to carry to the far corners of the bank's lobby. "I've been doing business with this bank for 15 years, and I've never been treated with such disrespect." "Nobody's calling you a liar, Harold," Peterson said, using the first name that most people in Millerville had earned the right to use after decades of neighborly relations. "We're just following proper banking procedures. If you believe you deposited more money than we're showing, we can investigate further. But right now, the evidence supports Miss Mackenzie's count." Harold gathered up his deposit slip and notebook with the kind of theatrical dignity that was supposed to convey wounded pride and moral superiority. "This isn't over," he announced to the bank in general and Patsy McKenzie in particular. "I'll be back with proof that your counting is wrong." After Harold left, trailing righteous indignation like exhaust from his pickup truck, Peterson returned to his office Patsy resumed her duties as if nothing unusual had happened. But the other customers who had witnessed the confrontation began to talk. And in a town the size of Millerville, talk had a way of spreading like oil on water. By lunchtime, the story of Harold Zimmerman's disputed penny had reached the coffee shop, the grain elevator, the post office, and 3 different churches. By dinner time, it had been embellished, analyzed, and debated until it had taken on a significance far beyond its original scope. Some people sided with Harold, arguing that customers should be given the benefit of the doubt in minor disputes, and that banks should prioritize customer relations over rigid adherence to procedures. Others supported Patsy, maintaining that accuracy in financial transactions was too important to compromise for the sake of politeness. But the real impact of the incident became apparent the next morning when Harold Zimmerman returned to the First National Bank of Millerville, carrying a canvas bag that was significantly larger than the one he had brought the previous day. "Morning, Patsy," Harold said, his voice carrying the kind of forced cheerfulness that suggested he had spent considerable time preparing for this encounter. "I've got another deposit for you today, and this time I want you to count every single coin while I watch." Patsy accepted the bag with her usual professional courtesy, though she couldn't help noticing that it seemed unusually heavy for a typical grain elevator deposit. When she opened it and began removing the contents, she discovered why. Harold Zimmerman had brought her approximately 4,000 pennies. Not $4,000 in pennies, 4,000 individual pennies, representing $40 in value, but requiring individual handling and counting of each coin. They filled the canvas bag like copper gravel, and when Patsy poured them onto her counting tray, they cascaded over the edges and scattered across her workstation like metallic confetti. "There you go, Patsy," Harold announced with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had devised the perfect response to yesterday's slight. 4,000 pennies, each one counted individually. I want them all deposited to my account, and I want you to count every single one while I stand here and verify your accuracy. The lobby of the First National Bank of Millerville went completely silent. Other customers stopped their conversations and turned to stare at the mountain of pennies that had transformed Patsy McKenzie's orderly workstation into what looked like the site of a mining accident. Patsy looked at the scattered coins, then at Harold's triumphant expression, then at the growing line of customers who were beginning to realize that their banking transactions were going to be significantly delayed. "Mr. Zimmerman," she said with remarkable composure, "counting 4,000 pennies is going to take considerable time. Are you certain you want to proceed with this transaction?" "Oh, I'm certain," Harold replied. "Yesterday you made it very clear that accuracy is more important than customer convenience. So let's be accurate. Count every penny, and I'll verify your total." What Harold Zimmerman had intended as a form of theatrical revenge quickly transformed into something much more significant. As Patsy began the tedious process of counting pennies, sorting them into piles of 10, then combining the piles into groups of 50, then organizing the groups into columns that could be efficiently counted and verified, other customers began to take notice of what was happening. Word spread quickly through Millerville that Harold Zimmerman was showing up the bank by forcing them to count thousands of pennies. Some people interpreted this as a clever response to perceived poor customer service. Others saw it as petty harassment of a hardworking bank employee who had simply been doing her job correctly. But the most significant reaction came from people who began to see Harold's penny deposit as a form of protest against what they perceived as the increasing impersonality and bureaucracy of modern banking. In their minds, Harold was making a statement about the importance of treating customers with respect and flexibility, rather than hiding behind rigid procedures and policies. By Thursday morning, 3 other customers had arrived at the First National Bank of Millerville with their own bags of pennies. By Friday, there were 7. By the following Monday, the line of people waiting to make penny deposits extended out the bank's front door and halfway down Main Street. The Millerville Gazette, which normally struggled to fill its 8 pages with news about school board meetings and crop reports, suddenly found itself covering the most significant local story in decades. Editor Ralph Morrison wrote a front-page article titled "The Great Penny Protest. Local Residents Support Customer Rights," which presented Harold Zimmerman as a principled citizen standing up against bureaucratic inflexibility. The article was picked up by newspapers in surrounding towns, then by regional papers, and eventually by the Kansas City Star, which ran a feature story about the small town bank under siege by penny protesters. The story portrayed the conflict as a David and Goliath battle between ordinary citizens and institutional authority, with thousands of copper coins serving as the weapons of choice. What nobody anticipated was that the publicity would inspire similar protests in other communities throughout Kansas, Missouri, and eventually across the Midwest. Bank customers who had their own grievances against perceived poor service began arriving at local banks with bags of pennies, demanding that each coin be individually counted and verified. The phenomenon spread with remarkable speed, aided by newspaper coverage and word-of-mouth communication that traveled along the informal networks connecting small communities throughout the region. Within 3 weeks of Harold Zimmerman's original dispute, banks in more than 40 towns were dealing with customers who insisted on making deposits consisting entirely of pennies. The impact on banking operations was immediate and severe. Counting thousands of pennies required far more time than processing normal deposits, creating delays that affected all customers and strained the limited staff resources of small-town banks. Tellers who had been accustomed to handling a few hundred transactions per day found themselves spending entire mornings counting coins for single customers. But the real crisis emerged when the penny protesters began to exhaust the available supply of pennies in their communities. Harold Zimmerman's 4,000 pennies had come from his own accumulated change, collected over months from the grain elevator's cash transactions. When other customers wanted to make similar deposits, they had to obtain pennies from local businesses, friends, and family members. The demand for pennies quickly exceeded the supply available through normal commercial channels. Banks that had routinely exchanged rolled coins for paper money found themselves unable to provide the pennies that customers were requesting. Businesses that normally accumulated small change discovered that their usual sources, banks and regular customers, no longer had coins available. Within a month of the original incident at the First National Bank of Millerville, communities throughout the Midwest were experiencing acute shortages of pennies and other small coins. The Federal Mint, which had been producing coins at levels designed to meet normal commercial demand, was suddenly faced with requests for increased production that far exceeded their capacity. The situation was complicated by the fact that many of the pennies being deposited in the penny protests were immediately withdrawn again as customers prepared for additional protest deposits. Coins were circulating through the banking system much more rapidly than normal, but they weren't actually fulfilling their intended function as a medium of exchange for routine commercial transactions. By May 1964, the penny shortage had become serious enough to attract attention from federal banking regulators and Treasury Department officials. The director of the Mint, Eva Adams, issued a public statement acknowledging that coin production was struggling to meet unusually high demand and requesting that citizens avoid hoarding or unnecessary accumulation of coins for non-commercial purposes. The statement had the opposite of its intended effect. Media coverage of the federal government's concern about coin shortages convinced many people that the penny protests represented a genuine threat to the banking system, and that participating in such protests was an effective way to express dissatisfaction with various government and corporate policies. What had started as a dispute over a single penny between a bank teller and a grain elevator operator had evolved into a national movement that was affecting monetary policy and forcing federal officials to reconsider their assumptions about coin production and distribution. The situation reached a crisis point in June 1964, when the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City reported that member banks throughout their district were experiencing severe shortages of pennies, nickels, and dimes. Normal commercial transactions were being disrupted because businesses couldn't make proper change, and some retailers were rounding prices to the nearest quarter to avoid the problem entirely. Treasury Secretary Douglas Dillon convened an emergency meeting of Mint officials, Federal Reserve representatives, and banking industry leaders to address what newspapers had begun calling the Great American Coin Crisis of 1964. The meeting was held in Washington, but its agenda was dominated by a problem that had originated in Millerville, Kansas, population 3,847. Meanwhile, back in Millerville, Patsy McKenzie continued to count pennies with the same methodical accuracy that had started the entire crisis. She had become something of a local celebrity, with newspaper reporters and curiosity seekers visiting the bank to watch her sort through thousands of copper coins with unflappable precision. Interviews with Patsy revealed a woman who was bemused by the national attention her commitment to accuracy had generated, but who remained unwavering in her belief that banking procedures existed for good reasons and should not be compromised for the sake of customer convenience or public relations. "I didn't start this," she told a reporter from the Kansas City Star. "I just did my job the way I was trained to do it. If people want to deposit their money in pennies, I'll count every single coin and make sure the total is correct. That's what banks are supposed to do." When asked whether she regretted refusing to accept Harold Zimmerman's disputed penny, Patsy's response was characteristically direct. "I regret that people have turned this into something bigger than it needed to be. But I don't regret standing up for accuracy in banking. People trust us with their money, and that trust has to be earned through careful attention to detail, not through taking shortcuts to avoid conflict." The federal response to the coin crisis was swift and comprehensive. The Treasury Department authorized emergency increases in mint production, with facilities operating around the clock to produce additional pennies, nickels, and dimes. The Federal Reserve implemented new distribution procedures designed to ensure that coins reached areas where they were most needed. But the most significant intervention came from an unexpected source: the Internal Revenue Service. IRS officials had been monitoring the penny protests with growing concern, not because of their impact on coin supplies, but because of their potential tax implications. Large deposits of coins that were immediately withdrawn and redeposited could be interpreted as attempts to manipulate financial records or create artificial transaction volumes for tax purposes. While most of the penny protesters were clearly acting out of genuine frustration with banking service rather than trying to evade taxes, the unusual nature of their transactions had attracted attention from federal investigators who specialized in detecting financial irregularities. In July 1964, the IRS announced that it would be conducting audits of individuals and businesses that had made unusually large or frequent deposits, consisting primarily of coins, during the previous 6 months. The announcement was intended as a warning to discourage further penny protests, but it also had the effect of legitimizing the protesters' complaints about government and corporate overreach. Harold Zimmerman, who had started the entire crisis over a disputed penny, suddenly found himself receiving correspondence from IRS auditors requesting detailed documentation of his grain elevator's cash transactions. The irony was not lost on him. His attempt to protest perceived banking inflexibility had resulted in federal scrutiny of his business operations that was far more intrusive than anything he had experienced from the First National Bank of Millerville. The publicity surrounding the IRS audits generated sympathy for the penny protesters and criticism of what many people saw as a heavy-handed federal response to a grassroots expression of consumer dissatisfaction. Editorial writers and political commentators began to characterize the coin crisis as an example of how government bureaucracy could escalate minor local disputes into national emergencies. Senator Frank Carlson of Kansas, responding to constituent pressure, introduced legislation that would limit the federal government's authority to investigate banking transactions that were clearly intended as expressions of political protest, rather than attempts to evade taxes or regulations. The bill, dubbed the Penny Protection Act by its supporters, became a rallying point for people who believed that citizens should have the right to conduct legal forms of civil disobedience without fear of federal retaliation. By August 1964, the penny protests had evolved from a local banking dispute into a national political movement that touched on issues of consumer rights, federal authority, and the relationship between individual citizens and large institutions. The original dispute between Patsy McKenzie and Harold Zimmerman had been forgotten in the larger narrative about government overreach and corporate unresponsiveness, but the practical effects of the coin shortage continued to disrupt commerce throughout the Midwest. Businesses that depended on cash transactions, vending machine operators, parking meter companies, laundromats, and small retailers found themselves unable to function normally because customers couldn't provide exact change, and businesses couldn't make proper change in return. The problem was particularly acute for businesses that served low-income customers who relied primarily on cash rather than checks or credit cards. Many small stores in urban and rural areas began refusing to accept large bills because they didn't have enough coins to make change, effectively excluding customers who couldn't afford to shop at larger retailers that had better access to banking services. The social impact of the coin shortage began to generate criticism from civil rights organizations and poverty advocates who argued that the penny protests were having a disproportionate effect on the communities that could least afford to be disrupted. The NAACP issued a statement pointing out that coin shortages were making it difficult for people in low-income neighborhoods to purchase necessities, while wealthier customers could simply use checks or credit cards to avoid the problem. This criticism created a backlash against the penny protests, as participants began to realize that their actions were affecting people who had nothing to do with the original banking dispute. Media coverage began to shift from sympathetic portrayals of grassroots protest to more critical analysis of the protesters' methods and their impact on innocent bystanders. Harold Zimmerman, who had become the unofficial spokesman for the penny protest movement, found himself facing increasingly hostile questions about whether his dispute with a small-town bank teller justified the economic disruption that was affecting thousands of people throughout the region. In a press conference held at the Millerville grain elevator in late August, Harold attempted to explain his position and respond to his critics. "This was never about hurting anybody," he said. "This was about standing up for the principle that customers deserve to be treated with respect, and that businesses should be held accountable for their mistakes." When reporters asked whether he planned to continue the penny protests, despite their negative effects on low-income communities, Harold's response revealed the extent to which the situation had spiraled beyond his original intentions. "I never wanted this to become a national crisis," he admitted. "I just wanted the bank to admit they made a mistake and credit my account for the penny they owed me. But once it became clear that banks were using government regulations to avoid taking responsibility for their errors, it became about something bigger than just one penny." The press conference was widely covered, and Harold's comments were interpreted by many as an admission that the protests had achieved their original purpose and should be discontinued. Several prominent supporters of the movement announced that they would stop making penny deposits and encourage others to do the same. But by this point, the penny protests had taken on a momentum of their own. Many participants were no longer motivated by the original banking dispute, but by broader grievances against government and corporate authority that they saw the protests as addressing. The movement had attracted support from various activist groups that were using the coin shortage as a platform for expressing their own political agendas. The situation was further complicated by copycat protests that had emerged in other parts of the country, organized by people who had read about the Kansas penny protests and decided to implement similar tactics to address their own local grievances. Banks in California were dealing with customers who demanded that their transactions be conducted entirely in silver dollars. Banks in New York faced protesters who insisted on depositing rolled coins that had to be opened and individually counted to verify their contents. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York reported that coin shortages were beginning to affect commercial operations in several major metropolitan areas, and Treasury Department officials warned that the situation could become a serious threat to the stability of the national monetary system if it continued to spread. President Lyndon Johnson, who was already dealing with escalating involvement in Vietnam and the challenges of implementing his Great Society domestic programs, was briefed on the coin crisis during a cabinet meeting in early September. According to later accounts, Johnson's response was characteristically direct and profane. Though the exact words he used cannot be repeated in a family-friendly historical narrative, the president's staff was tasked with developing a comprehensive solution to the coin crisis that would address both the immediate practical problems and the underlying political issues that had allowed a minor banking dispute to escalate into a national emergency. The solution, when it came, was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. On September 15, 1964, President Johnson announced the creation of the National Coin Reserve Program, which would provide emergency supplies of coins to any community that was experiencing shortages due to unusual demands or disruptions in normal circulation patterns. The program was administered through the Federal Reserve System, but it was presented as a temporary measure designed to ensure that all Americans had access to the coins they needed for normal commercial transactions. Communities could request emergency coin supplies without having to provide detailed explanations for why they were experiencing shortages, and the coins would be delivered within 48 hours of receiving a request. The announcement was accompanied by a presidential statement that praised the patriotic Americans who have expressed their concerns about banking and government services through peaceful and legal means, while also noting that the time has come to ensure that all citizens have access to the currency they need for their daily lives. The National Coin Reserve Program was, in effect, a face-saving surrender to the penny protesters. By providing unlimited supplies of coins to communities that requested them, the federal government was removing the scarcity that had given the protests their power. Protesters could continue to deposit thousands of pennies if they wanted to, but they would no longer be disrupting commerce or affecting innocent bystanders. The program also addressed the political concerns that had been raised about federal overreach and IRS harassment. The emergency coin supplies were provided without questions or investigations, and the Treasury Department announced that it would discontinue audits of individuals who had participated in coin-related protests unless there was clear evidence of actual tax evasion. Within 2 weeks of the program's announcement, coin shortages throughout the affected regions had been eliminated. Banks that had been struggling to provide change for normal transactions suddenly had more than adequate supplies of all denominations. Businesses that had been forced to round prices or refuse certain transactions were able to return to normal operations. The penny protesters, faced with unlimited supplies of the coins they had been using as tools of demonstration, gradually lost interest in continuing their deposits. Without the scarcity that had made their protests economically disruptive, the act of depositing thousands of pennies became just an inconvenient and time-consuming banking transaction that served no practical purpose. By October 1964, the Great American Coin Crisis was essentially over. The last significant penny protest took place at a bank in Independence, Missouri, where a local businessman deposited 12,000 pennies to protest what he claimed was discriminatory treatment by loan officers. The deposit was counted accurately, recorded properly, and processed without incident. Nobody else in Independence seemed to notice or care. The National Coin Reserve Program was quietly discontinued in December 1964 after Treasury Department officials determined that coin circulation patterns had returned to normal throughout the affected regions. The emergency production increases at mint facilities were scaled back to routine levels, and the special distribution procedures were replaced by standard Federal Reserve protocols. But the effects of the coin crisis continued to influence banking and monetary policy for years afterward. The Federal Reserve implemented new procedures for monitoring coin circulation and identifying potential shortages before they could become disruptive. The Treasury Department developed contingency plans for responding to similar crises in the future, including protocols for emergency production increases and alternative distribution methods. Perhaps more importantly, the crisis led to significant changes in how banks approached customer relations and dispute resolution. The negative publicity generated by the penny protests had demonstrated that poor customer service could escalate into serious public relations problems, and banks throughout the country began implementing training programs and policies designed to prevent similar incidents. The American Bankers Association developed new guidelines for handling customer disputes, emphasizing the importance of flexibility and common sense in resolving minor discrepancies. Teller training programs began, including modules on conflict resolution and customer psychology, recognizing that technical accuracy was not always sufficient for maintaining positive customer relationships. For Patsy McKenzie, the resolution of the crisis brought both relief and a measure of vindication. Her commitment to accuracy had been proven correct. The disputed penny had indeed not been in Harold Zimmerman's original deposit, but she had also learned valuable lessons about the importance of balancing procedural correctness with customer relations. In interviews conducted years later, Patsy reflected on the crisis with characteristic thoughtfulness. I still believe that accuracy is important in banking, and I would handle the disputed penny the same way if I had to do it over again. But I also learned that being right isn't always enough. You have to help people understand why procedures exist and why following them correctly benefits everyone in the long run. Patsy continued working at the First National Bank of Millerville until her retirement in 1987, eventually becoming head teller and then assistant branch manager. She was known throughout her career for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to resolve customer disputes before they could escalate into larger conflicts. Harold Zimmerman's experience with the penny protests had a more complex impact on his life and worldview. the IRS audit of his grain elevator business, while ultimately finding no evidence of wrongdoing, had been a stressful and expensive ordeal that forced him to hire accountants and lawyers to deal with federal investigators. The national attention he had received as the leader of the penny protest movement had initially been gratifying, but it gradually became a burden as he realized that many people blamed him for the economic disruption that had affected communities throughout the Midwest. Local criticism was particularly painful, as neighbors and business associates began to question whether his dispute with the bank had been worth the trouble it had caused. In later years, Harold would tell people that the penny protests had taught him important lessons about the unintended consequences of even well-intentioned actions. "I just wanted the bank to admit they made a mistake," he would say. "I never imagined that standing up for one penny could cause so much trouble for so many people." Harold continued operating the grain elevator until his retirement in 1978, and he remained active in community affairs, serving on the school board and volunteering with various local organizations. But he was always careful to avoid conflicts that might escalate beyond their original scope, having learned firsthand how quickly small disputes could spiral out of control. The lasting legacy of the Great American Coin Crisis of 1964 can be seen in the changes it prompted in banking practices, customer service training, and crisis management procedures. The incident demonstrated how modern communication and transportation networks could amplify local disputes into national movements, and how institutions needed to be prepared to address not just immediate problems, but their broader social and political implications. The crisis also illustrated the complex relationship between individual rights and collective responsibility in a democratic society. The penny protesters had every legal right to deposit their money in whatever form they chose, but the exercise of that right had consequences for people who were not involved in the original dispute and who had no voice in its resolution. These lessons became increasingly relevant as American society became more interconnected, and as local incidents gained the potential to influence national policy and public opinion. The penny protests of 1964 were among the first grassroots movements to demonstrate how ordinary citizens could use economic tactics to challenge institutional authority, presaging later movements that would use similar strategies to address civil rights, environmental, and consumer protection issues. Today, the First National Bank of Millerville still operates from the same building on Main Street and 2nd Avenue, though it's now part of a regional banking chain that absorbed the old First National sometime in the 1990s. The building still bears the date, 1923, carved into its cornerstone, and the vault door still requires 2 people to spin its massive handle. But if you walk into that bank today and ask about the Great Coin Crisis of 1964, you'll likely be met with blank stares from tellers who weren't born when Patsy McKenzie counted her last penny. The institutional memory of those chaotic months has faded like old newspaper clippings, reduced to a few yellowed articles in the Millerville Historical Society's archives, and the occasional story told by elderly residents who remember when their small town briefly stood at the center of a national controversy. The grain elevator that Harold Zimmerman operated for 23 years was demolished in 1995, replaced by a modern facility located outside town where larger trucks could maneuver more easily. The site where Harold once conducted the cash transactions that led to his fateful dispute with Patsy McKenzie is now occupied by a Casey's General Store, where customers pay for gas and coffee with credit cards and rarely handle coins at all. This transformation reflects broader changes in American commerce that have made the events of 1964 seem almost quaint in retrospect. The cashless society that futurists predicted in the 1960s has largely come to pass, though through electronic payments rather than the check-based system most experts expected. Today's customers are more likely to argue about declined credit cards than disputed pennies, and banks spend more time managing cybersecurity threats than training tellers to count coins accurately. Yet the fundamental issues that drove the penny protests remain relevant in our modern economy. The tension between institutional efficiency and individual customer service continues to shape interactions between consumers and large organizations. The potential for local disputes to escalate into national movements has only increased with the advent of social media and 24-hour news cycles, and the question of whether accuracy should be prioritized over customer satisfaction remains a daily challenge for service workers across every industry. The story of Patsy McKenzie and Harold Zimmerman also offers lessons about the unintended consequences of principled stands and the importance of understanding how individual actions can affect broader communities. Patsy's commitment to accuracy was admirable and ultimately correct, but it contributed to a crisis that disrupted the lives of thousands of people who had no involvement in the original dispute. Harold's desire to be treated with respect was understandable and justified, but his method of protest imposed costs on communities throughout the Midwest. Neither Patsy nor Harold acted with malicious intent, and both believed they were standing up for important principles. But their conflict illustrates how even well-meaning people can become caught up in dynamics that spiral beyond their control or intention. The penny protests of 1964 remind us that in an interconnected society, individual actions can have collective consequences that extend far beyond their original scope. The federal government's response to the crisis also offers insights into the challenges of managing economic disruption in a democratic society. The National Coin Reserve Program was an elegant solution that addressed both the practical problems and the political concerns generated by the protests. It allowed the penny protesters to claim victory, while eliminating the economic disruption their actions had caused. And it demonstrated that government intervention could be both effective and respectful of individual rights. But the program also represented a significant expansion of federal involvement in monetary policy, establishing precedents for government intervention in currency circulation that would influence responses to later economic crises. The temporary nature of the program prevented it from becoming a permanent feature of the monetary system, but it showed how quickly the federal government could mobilize resources to address unexpected economic challenges. The banking industry's response to the crisis had longer-lasting effects, establishing customer service standards and dispute resolution procedures that continue to influence banking practices today. The negative publicity generated by the penny protests convinced banks that technical accuracy was not sufficient for maintaining customer relationships, and that tellers needed training in communication and conflict resolution, as well as mathematical skills. These changes helped prevent similar crises in later years, as banks developed better systems for addressing customer complaints before they could escalate into public disputes. The emphasis on customer service training and flexible dispute resolution became standard practice throughout the industry, contributing to the more professional and customer-focused banking culture that emerged in the following decades. The social impact of the coin crisis also highlighted important issues about economic equity and access to financial services. The fact that coin shortages disproportionately affected low-income communities revealed how seemingly neutral economic disruptions could have discriminatory effects. This recognition contributed to later efforts to ensure that banking services remained accessible to all segments of society, regardless of their ability to use alternative payment methods. The criticism that the penny protests faced from civil rights organizations and poverty advocates also demonstrated how grassroots movements could be held accountable for the broader consequences of their actions. The protesters' initial focus on banking procedures and customer rights was legitimate, but their methods imposed costs on people who had no voice in the dispute and no ability to influence its resolution. This dynamic would become increasingly common in later social movements, as activists learned that successful protests needed to consider not only their immediate goals, but also their impact on innocent bystanders and vulnerable communities. The penny protests of 1964 were among the first to face this kind of criticism, presaging later debates about the ethics and effectiveness of various forms of civil disobedience. The media coverage of the crisis also established patterns that would become familiar in later decades, as local incidents were transformed into national stories through the amplifying effects of newspaper, radio, and television coverage. The way the penny protests evolved from a banking dispute into a political movement illustrated how media attention could change the nature and significance of events, turning participants into public figures and local issues into national debates. Ralph Morrison, the editor of the Millerville Gazette, who first covered the story, later reflected on how his initial article had contributed to the crisis's escalation. "I thought I was just reporting on an interesting local dispute," he said in a 1974 interview. "I had no idea that my story would be picked up by other papers and turn into such a big deal. It taught me to be more careful about how I frame stories, because you never know who might be reading them or how they might interpret what you write. The technological and social changes that have occurred since 1964 make it unlikely that a similar crisis could develop in exactly the same way today. Electronic payment systems have reduced the importance of physical coins in commercial transactions, making it much more difficult for protesters to disrupt commerce by manipulating currency circulation. The federal government's capacity to monitor and respond to economic disruptions has also improved dramatically, making it possible to identify and address potential crises before they can spread. But the underlying human dynamics that drove the penny protests remain constant across different eras and technologies. The desire to be treated with respect, the frustration with bureaucratic inflexibility, the temptation to use disruptive tactics to force attention to legitimate grievances. These motivations continue to influence how people interact with large institutions and how they respond when those interactions go poorly. The story of the Great American Coin Crisis of 1964 ultimately reminds us that small actions can have large consequences, that individual principles can conflict with collective welfare, and that even well-intentioned people can find themselves caught up in events that spiral beyond their control. It also demonstrates that creative solutions are possible when people of good are willing to look beyond their immediate positions and consider the broader implications of their actions. In Millerville, Kansas, the crisis is now remembered, when it's remembered at all, as a curiosity from a bygone era, a time when people cared enough about a single penny to nearly shut down the banking system of half a continent. The town itself has changed dramatically since 1964, with a population that has declined to fewer than 2,800 residents, and an economy that relies more on tourism and light manufacturing than on agricultural services. But the values that Patsy McKenzie and Harold Zimmerman represented, accuracy and respect, principle and pragmatism, remain as relevant today as they were 60 years ago. Their story reminds us that how we handle small disputes and everyday interactions can have consequences that extend far beyond our immediate circumstances, and that the choices we make in moments of conflict reveal who we are and what we value. The penny that started it all, assuming it ever existed, has long since disappeared into the vast circulation of American currency, indistinguishable from billions of other copper coins that pass through countless transactions every day. But the lessons of the penny war continue to resonate, reminding us that in a democratic society, every citizen has the power to influence the larger community, for better or worse, through the choices they make and the stands they take. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all, that in America, even the smallest coin can matter, and even the humblest citizen can change the course of history simply by refusing to compromise on what they believe is right. Whether that's a blessing or a curse depends, as always, on the wisdom and restraint of the people who wield that power, and on their ability to consider not just their own principles, but the welfare of their neighbors and the health of their community. The Great Penny War of 1964 is over, but the questions it raised about individual rights and collective responsibility, about accuracy and flexibility, and about principle and pragmatism remain as challenging today as they were when Patsy McKenzie first counted Harold Zimmerman's disputed deposit and found it 1 penny short of what he claimed. In the end, maybe that's exactly as it should be.